Good morning. Welcome to Hillstrong Group Security's webinar, The Road Ahead, Adapting OT Cybersecurity to an Evolving Threat Landscape. I'm Kara. Thank you for joining us. We appreciate you sharing your valuable time with us. Today, our panelists are Roger Hill, founder of Hillstrong Group Security, and Kevin Kumpf, OT Strategist for Cyolo. Before we kick off, as a reminder, this is a live event and we do welcome participation. So if you have any questions, please feel free to put those in the comment section and we'll get to those at the end during a Q&A. Again, thanks for joining us. Roger, would you kick us off?
Hey, thanks, Kara. I appreciate the introduction. And listen, I really appreciate you setting up this event. I'm really excited about this one. I think it's interesting going into the new year. Here we are, January 2025, right? So this is a great time to talk about what is the outlook for 2025. So, Kara, you've done a great job putting this on, and I'm just really excited about all the people that have registered and joining us here today. So I'm Roger Hill. So I am the founder of Hillstrong Group Security. So if you don't know me, I'll try to give you a really brief intro. Been in the industrial control system, or now known as operational technology space, for let's call it 30 years. So in that journey, started that early on with Siemens, 16 plus years, always on the industrial side, working a lot of different verticals, from applications engineering to systems engineering, specializing in distributed SCADA systems and PLC control. So it's been an interesting journey being on the application engineering side of that, the software development side, but then also with Rockwell Automation on the product security and securing the components and building out security businesses. So that's a little bit about me. We'll just keep it there. I'm looking forward to a great conversation. So I'm really excited to have Kevin Kumpf here with us today. So Kevin, listen, I've known you for a while. This is crazy. I don't know. It must not be a very safe area where you're at right now. I see the safety vest and hard hat. So you care to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Kevin Kumpf. I'm the chief OT strategist. And when I put out this introduction with Roger to say, am I going to do this event? Many people said, are you going to wear the attire that you wear at shows and you speak at events at? Because it truly resonates safety to the industry as an important component of what we're all doing. And so I decided that, yes, if Roger's going to drink his coffee and espresso live, I will wear the attire that the people have asked me to. So pleasure to be here, Roger, and I look forward to our discussion.
Yeah, likewise. So listen, let's just kind of kick it off and just talk about, there's been a lot of interesting things happening leading up into January. I think my read in Q4 last year was there was a lot of uncertainty. I think we observed that from the board down. You saw some of that uncertainty in terms of the economy, and many other factors in it. And where we really saw this play out was in some of the budgets, how budgets were being frozen. Well, now, as we're moving into this first quarter of the calendar year, geopolitical, there's so many things going on. What is your read in terms of what this means to the threat landscape, Kevin?
It absolutely is. In fact, just go out there and Google anything on geopolitical cyber attacks, and they're calling it the new Cold War. And there's the top threat actors out there that we've always heard: the North Koreas, Russias, and Chinas. But now, when you break down what geopolitical really means, it means basically anybody, anywhere on the globe can take and now, based on a political motivation or a ideology, as we're seeing, start to now attack infrastructure. And it's not just the large infrastructure. We saw it in the water industry here in the United States very clearly. And you bring up a good point about budgets and changes. 2024 was a very rough year for the cybersecurity industry. A lot of people laid off, a lot of people, the big AI boogeyman is going to come in and take your job. And we're still seeing a lot of that if you look at the hiring trends. But one of the things that's really concerning to me about this whole thing is the peak 65 of people leaving the industry, taking that knowledge with them. And so when these attacks do happen from these nation states and from these geopolitical groups and cells, who's going to handle it? And that's a big concern.
Yeah, I think that's really a fair point. One thing that occurs to me, Kevin, is we're talking about some of the emerging threats to the industrial control system and operational technology space for 2025. We should almost segment the critical infrastructure from other segments. So, for example, when we're thinking about critical infrastructure, power, whether it's generation, transmission, distribution, renewables, water utilities, things of that nature, and pipelines, the core critical infrastructure components. I think when we're looking at some of the geopolitical threats, and anyone that knows me knows that I detest FUD. I do not like talking about fear, uncertainty, and doubt. I like to talk about value-driven solutions. Having said that, I think you're looking at a different threat profile for geopolitical with everything that's going on right now for the critical infrastructure versus manufacturing and other segments.
Absolutely. I absolutely agree. And it's funny you bring up that, everything should be separated. What's been the big drive for the past year or two is to the cloud. We'll put that in the cloud for you. And even the vendors are embracing that you can do this through the cloud. Truth of the matter is, what I do my day to day is tell people that we can do things on premise and that you can keep that infrastructure segmented, because it's kind of ironic that I talked to a customer yesterday that said, I need to back up all my PLCs. And Roger, where does that happen in the industrial space where everybody has a backup of everything? There's no backup schedule for this environment. If you get your infrastructure hit and you're going down, you're going down.
I think that's a good point. And when we're talking about embracing the cloud, you mentioned the vendors. There's a couple of very major vendors that I won't mention that are just moving forward full tilt and not in terms of just embracing some of the traditional preventive and predictive analytics, but we're talking about traditional components functionality being cloud first, cloud native. I think that's really interesting because one of the things that I like to focus on is really the edge, right?
Mhm.
And I think anyone that knows me knows I've talked about this notion of what's not all that data, not all that high fidelity data belongs in the cloud. There is definitely value and merit to having this data within the edge of those sites with pre-processing and taking the output of that pre-processing to the cloud. That's more effective and efficient. It's about being able to run autonomously if needed.
And that's a very good point, because the reality of that is when you look at what they're trying to put to the cloud, I spoke just a couple months back, safety instrumentation systems.
Mm-hmm.
Why would you ever put those in the cloud? Why would you ever risk the safety of an environment for those type of factors? And
I
that's
certainly hope no one is.
yes. Well, if you look at some of the vendors, they're saying you can put that same data and same information on the same platforms that you're running your control systems, your operations, HMI, and other things to make it easy and simple.
Yeah.
And it's not.
Yeah. One of the things I wanted to bring up and get your thoughts on, and I've been talking about this for a little while now, is when we're looking, let's pivot just a little bit talking about the manufacturing sector. And I think there's a lot of industrial verticals there in that manufacturing sector. But when I look at the number one threat, external threat, that is, because really the number one threat is still internal. Not to say it's malicious, It could be non-malicious, but the number one external threat is ransomware. And what does ransomware look like in 2025? I think the last 3 years, we all know that manufacturing, depending upon the study, has been the number one or number two target of ransomware. I have some very specific thoughts on that. And I think going into this 2025 climate, I don't see that changing. I do see the affiliates and some of the actors within that space. It's really interesting because you can have nation state affiliates, but it's still financially motivated. And I think the nation state elements is really just taking off the leash, if you will. But where I am really concerned about some of the ransomware capabilities is where technology is really advanced. This is unprecedented times in terms of technology advancement. So we're going to see much more or greater sophistication, I believe.
We will, and for those of you who are sort of like new to the OT sector, because we have quite a few people here on this session. When Roger mentions malicious and non-malicious, the way I like to explain that is incident versus event. And so when we have an incident out there that is malicious in nature, somebody intentionally trying to do something, and Roger, you bring up the good point. 80+% of the things that happen in the manufacturing environment are non-malicious or event driven. And what that means is somebody made a mistake. Somebody, as we saw recently, tried to patch systems and took critical infrastructure down. There was no ill will intent of it. There was no ransomware component, but the result is exactly the same. And so when we marry that with now there's financial motivation. We just had a hack to the water industry where the password was 1111 and a couple, letters, and it was default. You look at the vector of where that comes from now, they're still, as an industry, saying email is the biggest threat vector for ransomware for OT. And yet you talk about keeping those systems isolated and separated. Now it looks like removable media, sharing information, data moving back and forth. So if your tool is an IT tool and it's attacking OT, how do we prevent that?
So that's interesting. And this is where I wanted to bring up something I see in the community. I've talked about this before, and that's what is the definition of a ransomware attack on OT? And I'm on a journey, right? I think in the early days post Stuxnet, I definitely was in that early pioneering camp of the ITS focus, and it's so completely different from IT. Now I think I've evolved to where it's really about the mission, right? And one of the things that I've really been focusing on here in the last year or so, Kevin, is this idea when we look at ransomware, what constitutes an OT attack? For example, I hear a lot in our community talking about, I'm going to bring it up again, Colonial Pipeline, and how Colonial Pipeline was not an OT attack.
Yep.
If the impact is the same, does it matter? In fact, what I would say is when you're looking at that particular example in the billing systems on the IT side, I think we need to start looking at the intersect of the risk of these systems. And that is the intersect of the building automation control systems at that site level, the industrial control systems that are responsible for the cyber physical process or automating of that manufacturing. But then there's the IT systems. So there's two different elements. We've historically focused on the direct. So understanding what are the data streams and the interconnections going into that industrial DMZ, right? What should be there? But what about the indirect, right? What about the inventory systems? What about the billing systems? If we have a system, so this is where we need to do threat modeling on the indirect, on the IT systems, so we can understand if we lose that system, will we be forced to shut down production, shut down distribution? Because quite frankly, if you're looking at a ransomware-based attack and we're looking at that security onion, the layers of security, if the adversary does not have to get into that process control network, let alone the control system network. Do you think they're going to? If they can accomplish their mission easier.
You're exactly right. And this is where, we look at things out there like the IEC, 62443 coming out, and people are saying this is going to help us, with zones, conduits, and everything else. But the problem is that, you walk a plant floor, everything's flat. All the infrastructure is basically interconnected networks. And then you look and you say, what is the real focus of OT? OT security's focus is safety. IT's focus is security. So when we pull those together, that intersection is that DMZ, the mindsets are different. And there's three words that have suddenly come back in the last year or two that were gone for a while: people, process, technology. And you're talking about when you walk a plant floor like you do, you need to know what asset is talking to what resource on the other end. What is the data flow? What is the user interaction? And even simple things like how often does it run? In the IT world, that's all basically, they'll scan their networks, they'll look at all their assets, they'll do anything they want. Go out and try to scan an OT network and see what happens. You know exactly what happens, Roger.
Yeah, and again, this is where my 2025 focus is really about breaking down silos.
Yep.
ITOG, right? That is my focus. I did want to get to one of the questions that I think is really kind of timely to this discussion right now. So we have a question out there regarding the IEC 62443 standards. So the question is, do you see the IEC 62443 standards using zones and conduits and putting security against those principles, helping with a new threat landscape? Short version, yes. Right. So, I think when we look at the new threat landscape, this is where I would put in asterisks, though. While I think zones and conduits is really a good approach when we're looking at 3-3 and then measuring with 3-2, absolutely. The challenge is getting to the point where we're actually utilizing some of the higher security level achievements within that standard with the zones and conduits. If we can achieve that, then yes. But let's keep in mind that focus is really from that industrial DMZ or that level 3.5 down. So, right. So what I'm talking about here, and let me just make this point really quick, is the intersection of risk when we're looking at ransomware and the indirect IT-based systems that might have that indirect impact of shutting down production. That's where I think we have to go beyond IEC 62443. It's very important at that shop floor level, but I think we have to look at those intersects. So Kevin, what are your thoughts on that?
I agree. And it's funny because you're using the term 3.5, and that's a Purdue model. And the Purdue model was never intended to be security based. It was architecture, reference model, that type of, the structure. Now we're putting 62443, which is zones and conduits, talking onto that architecture. And so you're right. How do we protect it? And if you look at the other regulations coming out there, the water, the rail, everything else out there at the high level, the pipelines, they're saying you have to have an incident response plan. You have to know your asset inventory. And you basically then have to have a process to do vulnerability patch management. But Roger, there's some industries out there that won't patch by enforcement for 3 to 5 years, especially in critical infrastructure. So knowing your assets is great. Knowing what you need to patch is great. But if you can't patch it, now we become that defense in depth. And I think that's where 62443 and your knowing the interconnectivity, that connective tissue of people, process, technology come together. It's all encompassing. You can't just take a standard and say, if I do 62443, I'm good. It will not work.
Yeah, I think you have to take a pragmatic approach ultimately. That's really my viewpoint on that. I think there's some really good requirements and approaches within the standards, and I think it creates a great foundation. You did bring up the Purdue model. The one thing I wanted to mention, because everyone talks about the Purdue model and the roots of it, and how those different levels, what are the different systems within those levels. Where I have used this very effectively over a decade ago, it was working with the early enterprise security folks and helping them understand this industrial control system world, and being able to very simply map out, okay, level 3.5 is at our industrial DMZ. And that's really the separation of IT from OT and shared information, right? And then we have a process control network, control system network, and field device network. And talking about the types of components and systems and how the speed of information, right? And how information is shared. That created a common language definition between these two new worlds a decade ago of IT and OT. Now I do see others talking about, the Purdue model as being security. Nope. Nope. It was never security. It's a common language definition. But it's good to have that common language definition, because that's how you start bringing the worlds together to solve problems.
And it's kind of funny because I've seen Purdue model architectures out there where the cloud is now level 6. And I'm like, did we just add this like another layer to the Big Mac? I mean, where did this come from? And that's because people look at an architecture and say, well, where does it fit? I'll just add another, zone to this and level. And 3.5 never existed in the beginning. And I think when you mentioned about, MES and MOM and this interconnection of systems, one of the things that OT customers are really starting to figure out, especially with Industry 4.0 and things, is that their data is now valuable and important and critical. Whereas before, they said, who would want to steal this?
Yeah.
Now we're at that point of, now the data is relevant. And I think we have to look at that in the scope of 62443 and everything else you're doing from a security perspective.
Kevin, I'm looking here at the questions. We've got another question coming in. Is NIST coming out with updates to the OT security framework? So I guess it depends upon the context of that question, because when we're talking about security framework, I'm not sure if the question was geared towards the cybersecurity framework, and which of course we're at the 2.0
level right now.
The one thing I would state though is, and this is kind of an interesting fact that a lot of people don't maybe realize historically, is that when this original work took place with the executive order, a lot of the industrial automation and OT folks and users were part of that. So when you look at this, and this is the difference between a framework and a standard, quite frankly, when you get from that function to the category down to the subcategory, right? And you look at the references from the NIST cybersecurity framework are already referencing different standards within the IEC 62443 series, whether it's 3-3, 2-1, so forth, right? So there's elements that are very applicable. Now, if the question there was talking more around NIST 882, of course, we 2024 brought us the new Rev 3. And what was interesting about that is a better alignment between the Guide to Industrial Control Systems and the NIST cybersecurity framework. Here's my thoughts, though, and I'll finish up with this, Kevin, and I'll let you jump in there. When I look at the NIST CSF 2.0 and I look at the NCCI, the NIST NCCOE, right? One of the things that I think they're doing that's really good is this concept of organizational profiles. So it starts with community profiles, organizational profiles. And I can tell you something that we're doing at Hillstrong. With all of our clients, we are developing a customized organizational profile for our clients that maps out and makes it and tuned for their organization. And then that creates a really great framework to intersect at the plant level. Now, the reason for this, at the plant level, we might have some plants that are utilizing IEC 62443, 3-3, right? We might have some plants over in Europe that are NIST 2. That's okay. Act regional with adaptability, then integrate into your organizational profile at the organizational level. And then you can also integrate on that northbound side into your enterprise risk framework. And I think that is one of the great things to leverage, whether you're utilizing the NIST cybersecurity framework, you can customize it without those organizational profiles. So I think that's really valuable.
I do as well. And one of the things that people don't really get about what, CSF 2.0 is, it's continuous improvement. And that was the whole goal, is to continuously improve and build upon what was there. The other part that gets lost in this shuffle is Gartner came out with CTEM, which was continuous threat exposure management. That is really life cycle management in any form. If you look at it, it's a circle of process levels. And those process levels in there are scoping, discovery, prioritization, validation, and they, I believe, call it mobilization, but it's really implementation if you want to get down to it. And so now, if you're doing continuous improvement, that comes into patch management, that comes into understanding your data flows. And when you're now putting it all together, Roger, what you're really doing is you're building that defense in depth, because if you can't patch, how do you mitigate? You hear so many people in OT say, I need to stop east, west, north, south traffic, because there's no way to do it down at the lower levels, because everything is basically interconnected. In the IT world, it's easy. We'll put a firewall here. We'll segment this network. You've been in enough plants to know that every plant you go into has the same IP address scheme on the same device at every single facility. And yet they're all totally different.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's an interesting point. And one of the things I want to give you an opportunity to really kind of talk about what Cyolo is doing. And, we've heard more discussions around zero trust within OT. I do feel like I'm maybe old enough and have an interesting journey where, I'd like to think I was talking about zero trust long before it was really defined, or definitely before it was cool within industrial software defined networking. But I'd like to get your take and what Cyolo is doing interesting around zero trust for OT.
Well, it's kind of interesting, because I've spoken at Carnegie Mellon and other places in conferences where everybody's there on a zero trust, and they go, I'm here to speak about zero trust. And they go up and speak, and I'll be the last speaker or second last, generally, many times. And I'll say, I'm here to speak about NIST 800. And then I'll use the 3 letters or the numbers SP for what that version is. And I had one guy in the audience who just spoke, said, I thought we were here to talk about zero trust. And so zero trust is this term that gets bandied about, almost like AI, almost like ML now. But if you look at the foundation, it's the 5 pillars of basically knowing your people, process, technology at a high level. And now they've put basically platforms underneath it, which is automation, governance, and basically control of the process. So that brings us to something that is out there called human in the loop, which means in OT, you always want that human to be in the process. Well, what we're doing at Cyolo is saying, if we know that there's less workforce out there, if we know that people now need to get out to these assets to see if they're vulnerable, to patch, to do things, let's do secure remote access. But also let's now tie it into other people, process, technology applications out there, so you can take, and now at a moment's notice, tie it into a change management platform, threat and vulnerability like CTEM, and you can have eyes on glass to see it all. And we're building that platform for people. That doesn't change that you have to patch. It doesn't make it to the point where one person can do that. Because, Roger, the biggest problem is you put that data up to somebody in an IT operations center, they have no context. And we've seen that numerous times, Roger. I'll just go out and patch those devices in OT because it says Windows needs an update. You've been on the end of those calls when they said somebody updated that Windows system and they broke my infrastructure. What do I do?
Yeah.
That's where you come in, is they call you because you have the knowledge.
Yeah. And that's a great example of what I was talking about, the different silos, right? So I have more than a few clients where it's a very similar discussion, right? Where they have their edge firewall. And then behind that edge firewall, the OT folks or the plant folks have installed their firewall behind that has a singular policy just blocking Nessus scans. Right.
And
So and then this is where it really gets challenging. And this is what I mean about breaking down the silos. Talking to the CISO and a lot of the enterprise folks, they don't even have access and allowed to view the policy on that southbound firewall. And that's where, if I could have one wish, and that would be for everyone just to take a step back and look at one thing. When we're looking at any type of manufacturer, and a manufacturer doesn't mean we're just building a car. It can be a chemical process. It can be anything. A manufacturer exists for one thing: to produce that product to the quantity that you need as a business, and to the quality that you need. Distribute that product to a point of sale and sell it. That is your business. Every other aspect of that business is in support of that mission, right? And we lose sight of the mission. So if we look at things from the lens of a mission, forget about OT, forget about IT, there's the mission. That's what we need to focus on.
And it's interesting because when you look at the IT realm, no matter how big or how small an office is, there are standards that a company follows across all of them. When you look at OT, you will look at the plants that manufacture the big industrial components like I've worked at, the Case New Hollands or other in the world, where they'll say, this is the king jewel here. It's putting out $1 million piece of equipment. We need security here. And yet downstream is the plant making the 5-cent widget. And they put less security to it because it comes out of the plant manager's budget, which is very small at that facility. And that is the plant that gets hit with ransomware. And now the entire chain to build that big behemoth is now compromised. You cannot get the end product out. And we're seeing this time and time again where they say, in your point of ransomware, I don't need to go for the biggest out there. I can now take a small town water facility and overflow the tank, as we've seen, and cause havoc and pain and fear to everybody else out there. So all they need to do is get that one little point across in a very simple way that now resonates through the media, through the understanding of the industry. But yet we're not taking the steps as an industry to bring it all together yet.
Yeah.
And if you look, Singapore just passed, last year, some legislation on manufacturing and stuff. And people say, well, that's Singapore. How does that impact me? Well, if you have facilities in Singapore, you now have manufacturers that you're working with in Singapore, as example. You need to understand that. How does it fit into you? How does that fit into the mission, the supply chain? And that to me is critical, is understanding your entire entity as a mission, not as individual parts or components.
Think global, act local. I think that is so crucial. So one of the things that we like to target on here at Hillstrong is the global manufacturer. That global manufacturer that has a presence across continents, 25, 50, 100, 200 sites globally, because it's a very interesting problem set, quite frankly. How do you apply a scalable cybersecurity solution across your operational facilities? And what do operational facilities mean? It's not just manufacturing, it's your distribution centers as well, right? So I think the point that you're kind of highlighting there as well, Kevin, is that idea of some of the regional risk and impacts, and that's where you have to act local. So I think it's really important to have a pragmatic approach to building out a global program. One of the things that I would like to maybe suggest here, Kevin, is I think we've spent a little bit of time now talking about threats, talking about some of the problems and the differences. I don't want it to all be negative, because
No.
I think the reality is there's some very pragmatic, not just strategic, but tactical things that we can take away and do. And one of the things I'd like to do is maybe talk about that, the global scale, right? So I think building out that global playbook, if you will, right? And what that means is having that, and this is what we do with the organizational profile, is building out that global framework where you have the ability to adapt and act locally. And I think that's really the trick. And I think there's maybe about 5 different controls that you take away, that if you focus on this from a manufacturing perspective, that's segmentation. I think that's one of the first and foremost. But there's about 5 takeaways that I think if you do these things well, you've improved your state. But it's also understanding out of your global sites. If you have 100 operational facilities, they're not all equal, right? They all have different strategic value and criticality to your business. Have you identified and ranked those facilities? What are your thoughts on that, Kevin?
So you're right. If you look at it realistically, segmentation is key. And that leads to the simple question of how do you segment? Because how manufacturing segments based on production zone cells, lines of making products, manufacturing zones, all those, general areas of these machines build this. We consider that a production zone or a production cell. But in security, you have to say, does that talk to something else outside of here? So knowing your assets is key. Once you know your assets, now you're going to segment in a different way than you will with what your manufacturing may be. Because you may say, hey, I have all these unique assets at all these different facilities. I now can commonly, centrally manage, maintain, control, patch, and observe all of these together. So there is one. And we do that in the IT world. You don't see people out there with 20 or 30 different databases in the organization, hopefully. They say, let's centralize that data. Let's make it one basically fortress and put a moat around it. And so if we know our assets, then we can know our connectivity. If we know our connectivity, we can understand the criticality of the data. If we know the criticality of the data and the process, then we can say, how does this impact my business flow? And as I said, it's the act locally, think globally, but everybody has to be on that page.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, you're really highlighting that foundation of, know what you have in order to know how to protect it. And that's the importance of understanding the assets. If I could, Kevin, maybe put another spin on that,
Sure.
in terms of a global, is outside of know what you have in order to know how to secure it. What about know thy business, know thyself, right? So what I mean by that is, have you done a concrete business impact analysis across your fleet of sites, from a supply chain risk? So, for example, what if you have 2 manufacturing facilities that the products that they're producing are for your other downstream manufacturing, where if you were to lose one of those sites, it would have a supply chain risk that could be crucial. And what if you're in the automotive space and you're supplying the OEMs and you're in some just-in-time manufacturing? That can lead to some violations against the SLA and a huge financial penalty. So
Totally.
I think there's 2 different aspects: know what you have, but also know what you have from a business perspective.
Yeah, and I worked on one of these prior to Cyolo here, where, and this may sound silly to people on the call, but it was such a ramification to this company that it almost put it out of business. A major chicken processing manufacturer. One of their employees took a picture of a screen in a plant showing just normal data and posted it out on the internet.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody got that photo, sent it to corporate of that entity and said, I've been in your facility, I have control, I can do these things. And basically at that point, they had to stop the production of what they were doing. Well, it backed up everybody, Roger, because now the chicken that was coming in, and if you think about it, let's take milk as another example. If you're a dairy processing plant, the cows aren't going to hold their milk for a couple more days till you're ready for it. So downstream ramifications of what happens if you go down. And this is really about your supply chain, and it doesn't now stop at, we want to do the cybersecurity framework internal here, or meet NIST or whatever standard.
Mm-hmm.
Your third-party suppliers are critical because your SLAs and everything you do now relies on them. And
Yeah,
so
100%,
yeah,
100%. And I think it's what it comes down to is the basic principles, and that securing this space is truly about people, process, technology. We get so caught up, on the technology side, Kevin, but we tend to forget the people and process side. So, for example, another common theme that I see at the plant level is there's always a person. And what I like to ask a plant manager is, if you have one of your production lines go down, what is the first name that pops in your mind of who you need in order to get that back up? There's always one person, whether it's an electrician, whether it's engineer, there's always somebody that's been there 30 years. They just know, these cyber physical processes inside and out, right? The risk is the human risk. And that is and this gets into the aging workforce issue, right? This is the tribal knowledge and just the knowledge that has come through pure dedication and time on the job, where we're not really replicating the knowledge of what these individuals have in the form of, operating procedures and guidance, so that what's that business risk if, not to put it in a negative light, but let's look at it from a positive light. What if they hit the lottery and leave? We have a lot of business risk there. So we need to start thinking about the basics of people, process, technology.
Yeah, peak 65 is here upon us, and anybody out there can Google it and find out that this is the first time in America, and basically globally in many ways, where the workforce is not being replaced as a number of people coming in. More retirements than people showing up for the work.
Yeah.
And this gets to what Cyolo is really doing a lot of, is you talk about that electrician that knows things. If that electrician is at another plant or needs to get to a component to do something, how do you do that quickly? And that's where remote access is coming in. We saw this with, COVID, where before, if you were at a plant, your contractors were coming in from a given IP address from an office. You knew that IP address. You set up a firewall rule. They were coming in from there. Roger, I can't tell you now where contractors are coming in from. And it's everywhere. And that's the problem, is it is now it took it from a very insulated process, on that end-to-end point, to now it's one-to-one has become one-to-many. You can be sitting in your home working on a plant in India, and tomorrow you're working on something in Mexico or in California or somewhere else. You're not there.
I think that could be an interesting segue to one of the questions I see here, about, can you speak a little bit about micro segmentation within new plants? So we've talked about network segmentation, high level, kind of a little bit of macro segmentation, and some of the secure remote access. And I think it's interesting. So the first comment I'm going to make, and I'll let you respond to this, in terms of micro segmentation. Way back in the day, when I was working on developing an industrial software-defined networking platform and working with DOE, we had a project of the autonomous attack surface reduction for energy delivery systems. And so this is very near and dear to my heart, this question. But what I will say is the ending part of that question about new plants, I think I can count on one hand how many new plants I've worked on in my career at 30 years. This is dominated, at least in the US, it's really dominated by brownfield. So it's a pure, unadulterated joy to have a project where you're designing a plant from the ground up. Just because you don't have those opportunities so much, because that's an opportunity to really do it right, because it's really challenging to do on the brownfield. Now, anyway, having said that, Kevin, what are your thoughts on some of the micro segmentation?
So you're exactly right. The reason that OT is you can't patch this, you can't do that today, is because legacy systems. I mean, I talk to people that still have paper tape systems running out there. So what am I doing as a strategist and looking at that? And I'm saying, well, if we can't trust the infrastructure is fully segmented, if we can't trust that there's security everywhere, the approach that we've taken in tools and in partners we're working with, and just as an industry, is to say, can we get them down to that one device to prevent things like lateral movement, at a moment's notice. And the term that comes back is WYSIWYG, because now you're seeing the ability to give somebody one icon to one resource to do one job. And then when they're done, pull their access. And that way, it's like the person walking up to that HMI, that PLC, or that control system, doing what they need to do, and then leaving the plant. It's the modern version of having somebody's boots on the ground. And the other part of the micro-segmentation that out there really gets back to what you talked about. How can you do a defense in depth to make sure that you understand that scope, the blast radius of where that person can be and what the impact is if you let somebody there? It's totally different from facility to facility. No facility is the same.
Yeah, 100%, 100%. And, I think microsegmentation, so obviously I mentioned that I'm a big believer, but it's also a little bit of a panacea. It's challenging to do in legacy environments. The one thing I would say is in terms of a more pragmatic approach, and this goes back to know thyself, right? So when you're looking at that system level, that system under consideration, one thing I would really urge is going through that impact analysis of what are the systems and subsystems that are most critical, and taking that pragmatic approach of understanding that criticality and taking that golden nugget approach, and then just defining what are the countermeasures that we should do, and not just from a technology perspective, but ensure that we have the right procedures in place too. Shifting gears a little bit, I see we have another question around: do you see regulations playing a role in nudging companies to invest in security where they have been reluctant in the past? If not, what are the major drivers to accelerate action to segmentation and solutions that can deal with uncatchable systems? Not sure what the uncatchable systems, but anyway, let me address that. So, number one, I would say, from my perspective, my opinion is regulations always drive action because regulations are associated with penalties, right? I think to frame that question in another way, are guidelines and recommendations and standards, is that enough? That's the more interesting questions, because often those are a predecessor to the regulatory type environment. I think when we're looking at a regulatory based environment, I would have to say, and again, my personal opinion, this is where the EU is definitely ahead of the US, right?
Yep.
The EU has really, of course, that's the nature of the regulatory body, is that they have really driven regulations around critical infrastructure and continuing to do so. The Cyber Resilience Act, and there's some really interesting things coming down the pike that are causing automation vendors to actually respond and take action where they started to maybe relax some of their work around vulnerability management, right? And now the CRA is causing them to have to reinvest once again. And I think we'll see this from owner operators as well.
My thoughts on that are, I agree, regulations drive things, but the regulations come up because things happened that went bad, and they said, hey, we have to have regulation around this. Cyber insurance is another way that companies say, is it cheaper to do cyber insurance for if I don't have something out there that's going to regulate me and absolve the risk? And you see, even with NERC SIP out there, I can put out something today. How many years before it has to be fully implemented, audited, and then reported on based on the cycles is another challenge. I will say an area that is really emerging, that is truly greenfield here across the globe, is, if we're talking energy, distributed energy resources, these giant battery farms, car charging stations that are going in at mass scale in not your home area, but you're seeing gas stations putting large banks of charging stations. That is a place to get in on the ground and say, let's do security right. Let's not retrofit. Let's do it from the beginning. And, distributed energy resources, solar, battery, wind, and things like that, These are now becoming the new energy source. And the hackers know if you take these down, you can destabilize the grid. And so getting security in there, to me, irregardless of regulatory, to do it right from the ground up is key. And we have to do that as an industry.
Totally agree. We were having a discussion internally about an idea of another webinar was really thinking about one of the trends that we're looking at for 2025 is the emergence of really ramping up data centers.
Mhm.
And I think part of that, what we're seeing with some of the newer data centers is power generation as part of the data center. So when you're talking about power, yeah, it's not just about the decentralized, distributed, like such as what you have over in the EU. I think now power is interesting. We're looking at more smaller uh, generation for specific use cases. I did want to get back, and I see that there was a note about the uncatchable systems was unpatchable.
Correct.
I've made those kind of spell check errors myself all the time, so no worries, no worries. So I did want to address this real quick. From my perspective, when I like to classify OT vulnerability management is not the same thing as patch management.
Correct.
Vulnerability management is to understand what goes back to what you have. What are the assets you have in place? What is the architecture and understanding what are the controls that are in place so that when we're looking at a new vulnerability disclosure, we're understanding number one, what is that triage and what is that impact across our fleets and across our systems, right? Because I'm a big believer in mitigation versus remediation in the industrial control system space, because often you can't patch because it can trigger a recertification depending on your industry segment. So patching isn't always the number one answer in the OT space. That's where it's very different from the IT world. And having the ability to mitigate is crucial. And that goes into some of the strategic selection of your security controls so that you're not just offering a security control as a countermeasure in reducing your risk today, but it's the ability to have a policy update for that control that can help mitigate future vulnerabilities that I guarantee you're going to be there. Anyway, hopefully that answers that question.
Yeah, I totally agree. Just one final point on your other one about the generation. A Bitcoin facility up here is now putting in their own little nuclear power plant to power just their facility. And so now you look at these and you're saying there is the ability to generate power for these unique use cases like data center, Bitcoin data mining, other things out there that you're going to see evolving rather rapidly because it's their own stable source of energy and they can control it and manage it.
So here's an interesting question that came in. What strategies and best practices can organizations adapt to effectively adapt OT cybersecurity measures to address the challenges posed by an ever-evolving threat landscape? I'm not sure if that's a question or a title for another webinar.
I think
It's really a good question. So,
It is.
I think we've addressed some of this. What I would say from a strategy perspective is having a global playbook. If you're a global organization, is having that framework that is centrally managed but is adapted locally. Number one, and then it's it's know thyself, understanding your business, understanding the impacts and criticality of what you make and where you make it, and what does that regulatory environment look like where you make it. And
Yep.
then going down, double clicking into that facility, then it's about know what you have in order to secure it. All of this is very crucial so that you can start to define your plants out of your 100 sites. Define tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 based approach in terms of criticality. So as part of your global playbook, you are designing a program where you're going after those golden nuggets first. And this is where I am a big believer in using a capability framework, such as your initial operating capability versus your future operating capability. So that's how it's all about putting the right strategies in place so that you can take the right tactical actions.
So my only comment to that is when we're talking about these regulatory frameworks and compliance and security, I tell people all the time, you cannot get proper security by just doing compliance. However, if you do proper security, you will be able to extract your compliance from that. And that's important because many people say, I checked this off the list, I did it for compliance, and it leaves the gaps. You do a defense in depth, you do proper security, you can extract the regulatory requirements out of that. And we're seeing that more and more because a lot of them are targeting specific security features. Do it right from the ground up and you'll get where you need to go. You can't go top down fully and expect success.
Yeah. Again, I think it's that think globally, but act locally.
Yep.
And that's, I've mentioned a few times about breaking down those silos. One of the things that I found is so beneficial for global organizations is the idea of your cross-functional teams. So if you're a CISO out there and you're now chartered with securing your operational facilities, one of the things that I would say is just from that relationship perspective is building those bridges to the operational side of the house. And what I can promise you is every single facility has some MVP in place, meaning the most valuable person in terms of understanding those processes where they're just irreplaceable. Understanding those different stakeholders and personnel that can provide that value, and assembling cross-functional teams where you're bridging that knowledge gap internally, and forging those relationships is actually crucial to having a successful program that doesn't have that pushback, because there's different perspectives, there's different domains of discipline, and this is where coming together in that cross-functional team to understand it's all about the singular mission, securing what we make and getting that to a point of sale. That's what we all have jobs for.
Fully agree. And that's where Hillstrong Group really comes in, is being able to build those bridges and get those people to the table and understand what they need to focus on from that disparate source, pulling all those MVPs together and say, let's champion a team and do it right from the ground up.
Yeah, 100%. Well, listen, I wanted to take a moment and just thank you, Kevin. I've been watching you during this webinar, and I don't think I saw any items fall on your head, so I think you were safe. So
I was, thank you. Yes, it was a safe zone.
Listen, great discussion as always, Kevin. I think you have a tremendous amount of experience and intellect on the subject. And I think I wanted to thank the audience. I think there were some really great questions, and I know we didn't get to all of them, so we will try to get to these questions post the event. And really thank everyone for their time, and great discussion. Until next time.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today. We know your time is valuable, and we appreciate you sharing it with us. Thank you to Kevin Kumpf for being our guest today. And if you had questions that weren't answered, please feel free to reach out to one of us to continue the conversation. For more information, please go to hillstrongsecurity.com or visit us on LinkedIn. Again, thanks so much.